Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here tonight at Academics Accessible. I really appreciate you all taking out time on a busy weekend. The point that we started Academics Accessible was to bring out public scholarship, and I really wanted to focus on academics who are who are in the university, but bringing them outside the university for general public and for promoting public scholarship, because that is where we get our perspective from. And as we have seen that our perspective has become more and more confined and restricted, and the generation gap has increased so much because we don't understand each other. And once we're done with our degrees, we think that our education is complete, but there are still people who, such as you, who are curious to learn more. And so I, upon my return after the Fulbright, decided on to take the challenge of bringing this academic knowledge outside the universities to everybody, to you and people who are curious to learn about new fields, what's happening in the world. Right now, Pakistan, in our culture, look at our academia. Some of the universities are doing great, but some of them are using outdated knowledge. And the point is that until and unless we try as a nation together to bring this knowledge that we learn from our Fulbright experiences and studying abroad experiences, there's no point in coming back to Pakistan and having a 9-to-5 job. And that's not my point. And this is why Academics Accessible was started. Under this program, we're not only just offering academic talks such as today and before, but we're also offering academic courses that are more philosophical and psychologically inclined. We're also offering workshops that are related to self-enhancement and self-development. We're also doing reading logs where we select a book and we read it in a month's time, but we read it together. We read it as an experience and we understand and we critique and we try to experience what the book is trying to tell us. So around this whole idea of academic accessible lies the fact that we want, at least I want, to engage the general audience and talk about public scholarship, talk about continuing higher education. And under this, I want to give a big shout out to Fulbright and USCFP and Dr Khan for helping us out in arranging this event and a series of the next 5 talks that we are going to have in September on different topics. But we start with today's talk, which is by Dr Ghazala Irfan. I'm sure most of you know about her. She has taught almost in 80 to 90% of Lahore. That's my statistics. And she is currently the chairperson at Forman Christian College in the philosophy department. She is also the general secretary at the All Pakistan Music Festival, and she is going to be talking about the 3 major paradigms in Muslim philosophy. This piece of scholarship work was produced when she went to the US as a scholar for an exchange program where she taught the Americans about her thesis on the 3 major paradigms in Muslim philosophy. So she's going to be talking about that today. So over to you, Dr. Ghazala, and I hope you guys enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Anam. Anam is one of my finest students because she is critically engaged. She takes the initiative, and that's not to say that my other students here don't do it. But considering that she has taken this initiative under the aegis of Fulbright, and considering that I put this research work together because of the Fulbright demand, I think it's a good way to also first acknowledge that this program challenges us. and that is why we're here. Quite honestly, like the rest of you, although I did philosophy, I knew very little about Muslim philosophy. Either we are taught Islamic studies or we are taught Western philosophy. So when I was asked, and this was a program called Direct Access to the Muslim World, it was a challenge for me, because I thought to myself, well, what do I know of Muslim philosophy? So there were these classical readings that were available, that is books that are translated into English, but of course they're abstruse and very hard to understand. And so I thought, and this is also I think something that we've learnt in contemporary scholarship, which is that we don't really do textbooks anymore. We need to look into original researches. So I thought, well, when I go out, I need to also make sure that I'm not just following a textbook. And so I had to really put together, and I have to give credit to Ibn Rushd, who in his book Decisive Treatise says, and he was an Asharite with an Asharite, a rationalist with a rationalist, and a Sufi with a Sufi. And I thought, okay, how do I organize my book of readings? And that is where I got the cue. So I divided it into these three paradigms, right? So the Asharite tradition is the conservative orthodox tradition, but it's not Islamic studies. I mean, I want to make sure that we realize that when we do Islamic studies, then basically what we are doing is the Quran, the Hadith and the Sunnah, and so in some ways that's not philosophy, that's the study of religion. And religion and philosophy have much in common, but they also disagree on the method. The philosophic method is about doubt, whereas the religious method is about certainty. And so the two find it very hard to meet. And so I thought, and since I'm not an alim, I thought I would talk about Muslim philosophy, which is how I got the idea of Al-Ash'ari, and I quite honestly never heard of him. Al-Ash'ari is the paradigm that we follow without knowing his name. So I looked at this, what is Ash'arite philosophy, and it was basically about the whole concept of what is called the chain of asnad. Asnad meaning names, the chain of asnad, and this is the same like we have in the Hadith. So we have X narrating from Y and Y narrating from Z and so on, so that this whole chain, and see the problem with that is if there is some problem with one person in the chain, everything else can just fall asunder. But anyways, the Asharite tradition was about this chain of asnad. So see, what we are saying is that tradition is what we are going to focus knowledge on. And so remember that philosophy asks the question, what is knowledge? And so now we are saying, what method do we use to seek knowledge? One. And two, do we just go by the regular method that is in the Islamic world, or do we look at the Muslims who maybe were deviants, maybe who would not be considered part of the Islamic scholarship, but they were Muslims who looked into the questions that all of us ask. And I'm saying this because at that time the situation was the same that we are confronting today. The scholarship is in the West today, and the conflict amongst us is, well, do we accept what the West says, or do we just deny and rebut? Do we use it in some way that we can incorporate, or do we completely reject? Do we move back into the earlier period, or do we also bring it to the context that we are facing today? So the problem for the Muslims at that time was similar to the ones that we follow today. Only at that time, of course, it wasn't Western scholarship, it was Greek philosophy. And so Greek philosophy is about the rational tradition. It is about the logical tradition. Now, here is where the real second paradigm will emerge, but I'll come to that in just a little while, because I still want to put this into a context, or let us say an intellectual scenario. If you really look back and look at scholarship, the ulama or the alims were the people who went by the Quran, the Hadith, and they were the ones who were the only people who knew Arabic. Now the irony is that in Islam there is no priestcraft. Everybody can read the Quran, because the Quran is a book of Hadaya, it is a book of how to live, it is a what to practice, it is not just belief. But the question is, if that be so, then do we all agree that there is only one and only one way? And we know that in the Muslim world, there was no uniformity of this is how we are going to lead our lives. And we, all of us here, know that right from the start, there was this differences of the various sects in the Islamic world. And so now whether, for example, the Prophet left a law of succession or whether he didn't, that was the cause of contention, the bone of contention between the Shia and Ali, who thought that he did, gave a reference, and the Ahle Sunnat wal Jamaat, who thought that the Prophet had left it to the Ummah to choose, right? So right there, the differences of opinion emerge. Now, as a student of philosophy, do you take this as a strength, or do you think there was a anarchy prevailed? I mean, one can look at it differently, and I will leave it to you to decide where you think, because is pluralism or diversity or disagreement, is it a strength or is it a weakness? This is debatable. So I'll leave it here. Also, because in the Islamic world, we have what is called, like I said, how to live. So law and jurisprudence became much more important than the belief system. So the faqihs, that is fiqh, became somehow predominated. Now remember also that even while we are talking about fiqh, there are 4 schools of fiqh in the Sunni world, and there is one school of fiqh, the Jafri school, in the Shia world. So here also, it's not that there was one and only one point of view and that everybody agreed. But I think what we missed out when we are debating this is that there was an ethics of disagreement. There was an ilmul ikhtilaf, meaning if you disagree, there is a certain way of disagreeing. There is a certain criteria according to which you disagree. So you can be a Hanafi, a Maliki, or a Shafi'i, or a Hanbali, the 4 fiqhs. And you know that at the time of Ziaul Haq, you could easily get a stamp paper and say, I am a Shia, and that meant there is no compulsory deduction of zakat. It wasn't that you had to prove that you were a Shia by descent and that your parents were Shia. There was nothing like that. So anybody can change their fiqhs that easily just by writing on a stamp paper. So here we are. What I'm trying to say is that there was an ethics of disagreement amongst the faqihs, and the Muslims lived with it. There was no issue about one and only one, and that everybody else is ostracized. Okay? This question of ostracization came with the Mu'tazilites. Wasil bin Atta was once from the school of Al-Ash'ari, but he disagreed. and he disagreed on the basis of reason. He said, and the questions that he asked were blasphemous as far as people were concerned. For example, he said, when you say that the Islamic world talks about not just unity, but the unicity of Allah, that is to say one and only one Allah, then the important thing is that everything else is one. The Ummah is one, the book is one, the Prophet is one, and there is one and only one. If that be so, what about the attributes of Allah? Are those 99 names, as we call them, are they all the same? We know that Allah is both Jabbar and Qahar and Rahman or Rahim. So what is he? Is he Rahman or Rahim or Jabbar or Qahar? And if it is just something that we cannot fathom, because this is anthropomorphism, that is to say we are looking at Allah in human terms, then the question is that the Quran, if it is a book of how to live, has to be understood in human terms. And so this question, when the Mu'tazilites asked, which was purely on a rational basis, there was an uproar. People said, you cannot ask these kind of questions. Okay? So questioning is not permissible. The other question that the Mu'tazilites or the rationalists asked was, and I think that this question is still relevant, is, was the Quran eternal or was it created? Those were the words they used. Basically what it means is, was the Quran there when Allah was, which means it was always there, or was it created in 12th century Hijaz, Arabia, which means it was in a context. So there were certain questions, there were certain issues and problems that the Quran responded to, that the Quran reacted to. And so when Hazrat Aisha asked the question, is Islam only meant for men? There was an ayat that said, O ye believing men and O ye believing women, meaning if he had not asked that question, then perhaps that ayat would have been maybe phrased differently, which means it is in a particular context. Now again, if you ask these kind of questions, that's blasphemy, right? I mean, what exactly are you trying to say? Now, we know that the Quran, the way it is framed today, is not really according to chronology. That is to say, it is not according to the first ayat and the second ayat and the third ayat. It is more in accordance with the length, except for a few ayats, it is all according to length. So if you don't know what comes before and what comes after, there is a problem in what to do. And this has been abused and used by people who take alcohol, because they say, you see, at one place the Quran says, God doesn't really like alcohol or nasha, let's put it this way, but as long as you can have surur and not get into nasha, it's okay, right? So because it's basically nasha that is forbidden, it is not taking just a little bit, right? But of course there are other ayats that say, no, it is forbidden. Okay, so is it not liked? Is it discouraged? Or is it forbidden? How do you know if you don't know what came before and what came after? Now again, this is what the question that the Mu'tazilites asked, that is the rationalists asked, right? And what basis did they use? They said, reason is necessary and sufficient. You don't need anything else other than reason to get responses to your questions, right? Now again, that's not the general faith of the Muslims. Why? Because revelation is much more than reason. Remember, the Greeks said reason is necessary and sufficient. But the Muslim world, and in fact even the Christian world, they said reason is necessary, but it is to defend faith. It is not in itself self-sufficient. Okay, so their basic difference between the traditionalists and the rationalists is on the basis of the mode of knowledge. Is that mode of knowledge reason, like the Greeks thought it was, logic, like the Greeks thought it was. So, do we use the logico-deductive method and think that it will give us all the answers? That's not what the traditionalists would accept. So, again here we have this controversy, and so we have the traditionalists disagreeing with the Mu'tazilites, with the rationalists, and saying, out with them, ostracize them, reject them, throw them out. They are asking questions that are creating anarchy and creating turmoil, right? So that is how the rational tradition actually never really flourished in the Muslim world, because right from the start the rational tradition is something that is taken to be only fundamentally unimportant, because it is human, whereas faith, which comes directly from revelation, is far superior. Now, this is interesting that both these traditions have survived, and these have survived in, for example, and I want to acknowledge that, like when I said to you that I put a reading pack together, this is the reading pack that I was able to get printed, and this is about the three classical paradigms that I mentioned, and I'm mentioning now vis-a-vis also, like I thought to myself, I'm going as a representative of India and Pakistan, South Asia, whatever you want to call it. I can't just talk about the rational tradition of Ibn Rushd or Al-Ash'ari in the traditional. I need to bring in South Asian thinkers as well. So I'm just going to talk about that also once I've mentioned the third paradigm. So the rational tradition really got developed in Spain. And you can also see that Spain is, in Europe, and at that time Europe was in the Dark Ages. It was basically Ibn Rushd who translated Aristotle, who got his ideas translated and sort of sent them to Europe. That was the beginning of the Enlightenment for the West, right? But again, we don't really recognize that, or we don't really acknowledge that, because somehow even the Muslims themselves don't acknowledge it. What did they do to Ibn Rushd, who tried to bring in the rational tradition? They didn't think very well of him. Half the time in his own work, like I mentioned, the Decisive Treatise, he's trying to defend and say there is no problem with reason. Reason properly used and religion properly understood are the same. There is no contradiction between them. He spent all his life trying to use that defense to see how this can be accepted by the Muslims. But of course, it wasn't really accepted. What happened in Spain also with the coming of Ibn Arabi was this shift towards what is called spirituality. So far it was either tradition or reason. Now the shift is towards what is called light or gnosis. And this comes mostly from Iran, from the Zoroastrian tradition, and also from the concept of the Christian tradition. Spirituality, and Ibn Arabi is also from the same area, so it's interesting that the hub of intellectual activity is an area in which there is influence also from Africa, there is also influence from the Middle East, and there is also the European influence. So that there is what is called the coming together of cultures and coming together of intellectuals, which brings about this sort of continuous change. So now spirituality is, you don't need to only look without, you need to look within. You don't have to discuss these kind of questions that the other two paradigms are trying to discuss. What you really need to do, not what you do, but really how pious you are, if you look within and see the impact of, the kind of life you lead, that's far more important. It isn't only the farz that you need to make sure that you fulfill, because you need to do much more than that. You need to worship and pray, and so in fact what is called the shrine culture is quite different from the mosque, so to say. But I'll also come back to that when we talk about India and Pakistan, because the shrine culture evolved more in the subcontinent than it did elsewhere. But nevertheless, the whole focus was on what is called pantheism. But now again, the person who came with Sufism to Lahore, Data Saab or Ali Hajweri, very specifically in his book, the Kashful Mahjoob, says, I am not a pantheist. So what is pantheism? Basically, pantheism says all is God, everything is God. So there is no difference between God and the universe. We have just been away and remote from God. What we seek is to go back, and it is a union with God. So the focus, if you notice, is union, it is not unity. And union with God is what we seek. So you see in the Simurg, that what you do is you look within to try and seek what is really within you, but it is spiritual. It is esoteric. It is not exoteric like the traditional paradigm was. So now you see, like I was saying, but see, Ali Hajweri says, I'm not a pantheist, because pantheism is also part of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Judaism. He says, I am a panentheist, meaning that yes, all is God, but God is more. Okay? God is above and beyond. It is not that the world is God. So when Mansoor Hallad says, I al-Haq, I am God, he is to be punished, because he is not accepting the fact that, that God is more than him. Okay? Now again, this is debatable. The Sufis say he never really claimed, he just said al-Haq, he said I'm the truth, I'm part of the truth, but other people say no, what he meant was union with God, and therefore he was condemned. In fact, he was punished more than anybody else in the Muslim world because of saying this. Okay? And yet, this is the strange thing. We in the subcontinent have been converted by Sufis. We have not been traditionalists. It has not been an Arab influence. It has been a Persian influence. And it has been, well, not even a Persian influence, it is Central Asian influence. I mean, our dynasties all came from Central Asia, our thoughts and ideas also came from Central Asia, and so did the whole concept of pantheism, panentheism, and most of us in the subcontinent take that. But see, the interesting thing is that we don't realize that this is in contrast to the traditional point of view. So, for example, you say, Masjid dhade, Mandir dhade. How dare anyone even suggest something like this, right? And yet, what we are saying is, we are saying, Bulle Shah is, is somebody that we revere and that we look at with respect. And at the same time, what he says, we don't really incorporate into our system. Oh, now this is the debate. Do we really incorporate that, or do we really incorporate the traditional aspect? Because, like I said, very few of us know Arabic. None of us actually have, well, I should say, none of us in this generation have bothered to look into scholarship. I was in fact suggesting to FC College, I said, we have what is called a religious studies department, in which the Christian Studies Department and the Islamic Studies Department. The Christian Studies Department have an MPhil, they have a PhD program, but in the Islamic Studies, they are only doing Islamic Studies that is mandatory for everybody. So one day I just said to them, I said, where's the scholarship in Islamic Studies? why don't we incorporate scholars? Now, and this is what I want to leave for you, because I've been arranging lectures in Lahore for nearly 30 years. But quite honestly, I have not been able to attract such young people like Anam has today. And I want to compliment you that you want to continue to learn, because my impression is that unless people get a certificate or they get some kudos for attending something, only then they attend. They don't come for the sake of learning. But it's heartening to see so many of you here, because that belies my own experience. But anyway, so what I'm trying to suggest to you, and the reason why I thought I would like to talk to you about this, is that we do need scholarship, right? We cannot just accept, and we just do what is called live it without understanding it. We recite without understanding. And you know that in Lahore, Masood Khadarposh, at one point, he conducted the namaz in Punjabi. But that was the only one time that he did. And after that, he sent his children away because he thought, this won't work. Okay? So we read the Arabic without understanding it. Either we understand what we're saying, only then can we live it, only then can we incorporate it into our lives. We can't just recite words that we don't understand. And I think now that the young people are thinking beings, which I think probably my generation wasn't. We accepted the chain of isnad, we accepted the conventions and the traditions without thinking, without reflecting, without speculating. So now I think it's important that we realize that there is this whole tradition of scholarship, and it is okay to learn that from the West. Apply it to ourselves, apply it so that we can make our lives more meaningful. Like I said to you, if the Quran is a book of hadaya, how do we know what to do if we don't understand what we're doing? So we need to incorporate the scholarship into our curriculums. So what I did was to bring in the South Asian context, and I will finish in 40 minutes and open it to the house, like I've been told, is that for the Asharites, I used Maulana Maududi. Maulana Maududi was actually a professor of Islamic studies at Islamia College, Lahore. But he brought in this concept with Qutb from Egypt, the concept of political Islam. And he started the Jamaat-e-Islami and then also the student wing. And so he was a conventionalist. So I brought in his work to for people to study. For the rationalists, and this is what I want to share with you, because most of us talk about Iqbal, we don't know whether he was a rationalist or a conventionalist or a pantheist, because he talks about the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. So he wants to reconstruct, he wants to reform, re-understand, but he's still using the tradition. He didn't say philosophical thought in the Muslim world. He said reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. That is his only philosophy book. So, on the other hand, he was a student of philosophy. He did his MA philosophy from Government College, Lahore, and he studied philosophy, even went to Cambridge and Germany to study philosophy. So the question is that he did philosophy and he brought in the philosophical methods to try and understand religion. On the other hand, half the time you don't know whether he's a pantheist, because see, the tradition of the subcontinent is Sufism. So the tradition that he was brought up in, he although he does critique it also at later stage. He says one of the causes of the decline of the Muslims is this unadulterated something Sufi. He mentioned something to that effect. So that's also interesting that the one thinker, we're not sure where to place him. But the third speaker that I sort of brought in the book was Data Saab or Ali Hajveri. And when I read this book, I was just talking about scholarship. This was in the 12th century. That is a book of scholarship. He talks about what is Sufism, and he doesn't just sit down and write from the top of his hat. He did what is called research. He went to X, who was a Sufi, he went to Y, who was a Sufi, he went to several people, and he mentioned them all, and he said, X said this and Y said this. He also went to people who said Sufism was all wrong. So it's not that he only collected all the evidence that was in his favor or whatever he wanted to produce. He also brought in negative input. And that negative input he was quite happy to incorporate. And for people who said Sufism is blasphemy, he was happy to include that. This is scholarship, right? We tend to somehow think that philosophy is the only subject that brings in uncertainty, brings in doubt, doesn't say anything, talks about strengths and weaknesses of the same thing, so it doesn't stand for anything. That's not true. When you bring critical inquiry into, that is scholarship, into the study of anything. Yes, you can get certain answers, but there is only some domains in which you can get certain answers. Not every domain you can get a certain answer. And it is just our quest for certainty that somehow we tend to just say, okay, yes, I've got it, this is the truth. So when we look at questions of what is knowledge, when we look at questions of what is truth, I think we need to look at the various paradigms, and we do have a start. But this is only an incentive, and I hope an encouragement for all of you who are here to try and think for ourselves and see whether we can bring in contemporary scholarship to the Muslim world. So, and I'll take questions because I was told 40 minutes and I'm on the dot, 40 minutes, but the rest is a conversation. So I just thought I will put something on the table, and now I will try and respond to whatever you would like me to talk about.
I'd just like to first take the question from the Facebook Live. So Bella Minas is asking if the name of the book is available and where can we buy this book from? Is it available?
Well, you can. I think you can apply. No, I think you can get from Amazon.
From Amazon?
Yeah.
Okay, and can you repeat the name?
It's called Three Major Paradigms of Muslim Philosophy. And while I'm at this, since you asked this, I want to thank Maryam Shafkat. She was the one who typed out this entire manuscript for me. And that's a lot of work. And you know, like I kept telling her, I said, go back and double check, make sure there's no problem. So while acknowledgements are due, I think I should add that.
To your question, I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us today, and especially Dr. Ghazala, who's taken out time from her busy schedule to be here today for all of you. I hope you had a great learning, and I think we had really, really introspective questions, and I really appreciate that, and that's the vision of this organization. I'd also like to thank Fulbright and the United States of Education Foundation Pakistan, who have sponsored these events and a series of these 6 talks. Also, Dr Khan, who is a co-host in organizing these events. A big shout out to the team at Dr Khan for arranging all of this. As far as your question is concerned, as I mentioned earlier, academics accessible is something that I have initiated, and if I haven't introduced myself, my name is Anam Nawaz, and I'm a recent graduate from the New School in Psychology, but I'm more interested in critical thought, public scholarship, bringing out new things, and involving the youth into this in developing a perspective that our nation needs today. And if you ever need to contact, we're available on Facebook. You can also visit our website, which is myvoiceunheard.com. It's an initiative we started about 3 years ago that focused on storytelling and highlighting the invisible narrative in Pakistan, and we do that through interviews. We have other events under My Voice Unheard by the name of Bola Chali, which are more like interview based, and we talk about the life journey of an individual, their challenges and what they're doing, and we try to promote people who have done great amount of work but have never really gotten the media attention. So we try to highlight those people who have less media attention but have done tremendous amount of work. If you ever need to follow us, please join our Facebook page, Academics Accessible. We are available on Facebook, on our website, and also on YouTube. Yes, on YouTube we have a channel, and Dr. Tanveer's talk on hermeneutics is already there, so you can view that for sure, and feel free to share. I'd like to present a small token of appreciation, which is by the Fulbright, USCFP, and Academics Accessible to Dr. Ghazala for being a part of this, and I'd really like to give this to her as an certificate of appreciation.